My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings. We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization, is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
The idea behind today's presentation, as has already been put in the brochure, was that it's to be presented like a lawyer presenting a case, and you are to be the jury to decide the evidence that I present to you, whether it's sufficient to prove that UFOs are somebody else's technology. But I want to make it a little bit farther than that. Rather than talking to you, I want to sort of talk to the press, to the public, and most of all to my friends and relatives who, when I first had a sighting in 1975, figured I was crazy. And a lot of what I have done is based on that. It's to evaluate the evidence and to play the game like a chess game. When I was very, very young, I played chess. I was fairly good at playing chess. And I used to wonder why people, when they played chess, just moved pieces for the sake of moving pieces. And to me, every move was always a move that you had to play to win, that there was an ultimate reason to move any piece in chess. So when we look at the presentation I'm making today, I want to sort of emphasize that there's a lot of evidence here that I looked at, and I tried to figure out, well, what am I going to present? And every time I present, I always have time trouble, that I almost feel all the time like I'm Bill Clinton and I have to keep it down to one girlfriend. And there's so much material. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you the material that I've accumulated since 1975, very short clips of what I thought was important. And I want to do it in that way, start with the weakest stuff and move to the most important stuff. But what I want to first identify is another lesson that I learned very early, in addition to chess, was my days at university. And I remember very little of my days at university. I do remember one very specific incident that occurred at university, and that was, it was a lecture in science, and there was a visiting astronomy professor. And basically what he did was to present to us a case. He said, "Prove to me the world is round." Our role was to produce the evidence for him. Now this occurred before I had my first UFO sighting. It was a very important lesson for me. So we proceeded to produce our evidence, and he played the aggressive, brain-dead UFO skeptic type. And to make a long story short, he won. Basically, it taught me the lesson when I first started ufology, and we have a very high standard. That's one thing that we have been faced with, that we are forced to present evidence in a much more stringent way than people in the outside world do. So the example of this professor gave us is prove to me the world is round, gave me the knowledge that you had to do it right. You had to come up with very specific evidence. For example, when we were there, one of the students brought up the fact, well, everybody knows the world is round. And it's the same argument we use in UFOs, that half the people believe that UFOs are real, and therefore this is some sort of evidence. What happened was that he said to us that the fact that everybody believes the world is round is not proof, because 500 years ago everybody believed it was flat. Therefore, common reality, what everybody believes, is not necessarily proof of anything. The other piece of evidence that they brought up was visual evidence, that some people had said, well, people have flown around the world. And like a good UFO skeptic, he said, well, that isn't proof either, because they only believe they've flown around the world. They may be flying around the edge of a coin, a flat coin, or they may be lying. So that evidence didn't accumulate to anything. The other thing that came up in this terms was, this was the sighting that I had. This was the object that sort of ended my life in 1975, or at least my normal life. This was Charlie Red Star, and it was the same sort of thing we use in ufology, that because we've seen something, this is some sort of evidence. This is a 1-second time exposure of an object. 1 minute later, another one that looked like it was turning on its side here. And the third one here, it had apparently just hovered. It had stopped moving. This one here is 1976. It's a photograph that was taken with my film. My friend was standing right beside me, and he took the photograph. It was a giant triangle, 1976. It had a green light in the back. We took this. It was a time exposure, and I found out right away that this kind of evidence was kind of lacking, because my friends and relatives really didn't, I mean, they like, yeah, okay, you took it, big deal, or I don't believe you, or whatever, that this evidence really wasn't all that strong. The other thing that was brought up in this course was people said, well, the horizon proves that the world is round. And he, of course, brought up the thing that we do to a lot of cases in ufology, is said, well, there are optical illusions. The horizon is nothing more than an optical illusion. That proves nothing. And it came down to saying that proving something, if somebody doesn't want to believe something, to prove to them that it's fact is a very, very hard thing to do. And that's how I started. I had to move from the sightings, which I figured really weren't helping anything, and to photography, which was brought up. People said, well, people have filmed the world is round. Astronauts. And we use the same thing with photography, that we use photography to say, well, this sort of proves that UFOs are somebody else's technology. And of course, the question arises, if this is true, if these astronauts who filmed the world showing that it is round, if that proves the world is round, then does it prove that flying saucers exist, because Apollo 16 took this photograph of what appears to be a flying saucer over the moon's surface. Now I'm going to quickly show you this just as an example of what happens to photography when you bring it up in the UFO field. This is the actual film footage taken by Apollo 16. You watch it moves, they pan to the right, the object disappears, and as they come back, you'll see that the object is actually moving back. It's getting farther away from the camera, and it's actually changed size and shape. Here's 1-second frames of just a few of the frames. I have time problems, so I only show you a few of the frames, moving this thing 1 frame at a time. So if the world is round because they photographed it being round, does it prove that flying saucers exist because it appears they photographed flying saucers? Here it is, 10 times the size, blown up, taken by Apollo 16 as they were leaving the moon's surface. And what happens in ufology is it's so easy to play the skeptic game. Skeptics immediately stand up, as NASA has done for this Apollo 16 footage, and has said, well, all it was an EVA floodlight. And this, they say, is an EVA floodlight photographed out the window of Apollo. Here is an EVA floodlight from Apollo 15. It's in the top corner there, you can see it. And they say that this is the same thing as this. Makes no sense, but here's another one from Apollo 15. There's the EVA floodlight in the bottom, and they say that's the same thing as this. And here's another one from Apollo 15 on the bottom right-hand corner there. They say that's the same thing as this. Then here from the same mission, Apollo 16 is an EVA floodlight on the right-hand side, filmed through the window. They say that this is the same thing as this. Here's another one from Apollo 16, the EVA floodlight, and they say it's the same thing as this. Makes absolutely no sense. And all I have to say to this is I may have been born in Canada, and I may have been born at night, but it wasn't last night. And yet the film dies. It's like the Mexican film. You take the Mexican film, it looks like this is it, it's going to break the UFO case, and suddenly some clown with a capital C stands up and says it's anything, and the media immediately says, oh, okay, and they print a story that says this is one side says this is the other side says this, and it comes out and everybody believes the skeptic side. Here is the EVA, well, this is the actual film. You can see it's actually changed, it's like it's flying away. So video doesn't really work. You start getting into testimony, and some of the testimony from other Apollo astronauts seem to show that if the fact that they filmed stuff, or that they saw that the world was round and reported this, what about the other stuff they reported? For example, Apollo 15, here's a photograph from Apollo 15, you can see up in the right corner there. Apollo 15 has a number of stories. James Irwin is now on the internet, they have a piece where he talks about UFO sightings on Apollo 15, and we have a story that we haven't released yet because we're afraid of a lawsuit. We have another story on Apollo 15, very dramatic story that was told by one of the astronauts, and we're just working through before we release this thing so we don't end up in trouble. But astronauts say a lot of things, and because they say the world is round, it really doesn't prove it. And it comes down to proof is very hard to come by. So when sightings and photography didn't seem to work, I went on the role of going after government documents and government involvement. And because I'm from Canada, I decided that I would go after the Canadian government documents that had been released by the Canadians. And I came across, this was put on to me by different people, Wilbert B. Smith. Now, some of you may be familiar with this stuff. I spent years researching this guy, probably 20 years researching this guy. I talked to all the people that were around him. He directed what was called Project Magnet in Canada. He dealt with Vannevar Bush, the guy that was rumored to have run the US UFO program. He dealt with the Canadian Prime Minister on the subject of flying saucers, and he also set up the Flying Saucer Observatory. Now, Smith's role in this whole thing, if you hear the Canadian government, they've sort of gone to sleep after this project ended in 1954. They sort of went to sleep and have allowed the Americans to run the UFO program. They're not really that involved. They've made a few comments on Wilbur Smith many years ago. They don't comment on him anymore. And they basically said it was a part-time project that he did on his own. So to show you this is a letter that Wilbur Smith wrote in 1955, and I'll read it, a portion of it. He says, "You may know that I am the fellow who was in charge of the Canadian government's Project Magnet, which was the official saucer study program. It ran from 1950 to 1954. It's important to remember that this was the official government project when you hear what Wilbur Smith's conclusions were in Canada. This is the place where it all took place. This is Shirley's Bay outside the nation's capital. It was the place where they monitored the Russian communications, tried to pick off all the stuff. This is where the spies would radio in. Wilbur Smith ran the whole show. He was a radio engineer, ran what was called Radio Ottawa. The small building there was called the Flying Saucer Observatory. Whether the Canadian government wants to admit it or not, this was sanctioned by the Canadian government. They had a Flying Saucer Observatory to pick up flying saucers from 1953 to 1954, and Wilbur Smith ran that as well. Wilbur Smith started in 1950, went down to the United States, and it's very interesting to see what he said, how he started. He said, in 1950, I was attending a rather slow-moving broadcasting conference in Washington, D.C., and having some free time on my hands, I circulated around asking a few questions about flying saucers, which stirred up a hornet's nest. I found out that the U.S. government had a highly classified project set up to study them. So I reasoned that with so much smoke, maybe I should look for the fire. And that's what he did. He started an investigation inside the United States. He started to talk to people inside the United States, inside the military and scientific establishment, and all this went through the Canadian Embassy. He came back to Canada and he wrote what is famously known as the Top Secret Memo. It was written in November of 1950. On the second page of this memo, there is written, the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist. Their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being put forward by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. Better put my glasses on here. The entire matter is considered by the United States Authority to be of tremendous significance. This was a top secret document. It was written in 1950. It was not declassified until 1978 or 1979. Stanton Friedman helped push this document out. On the third page of this top secret document, To see what the reaction of the Canadian government was when they received it, we read on the bottom, it's written by the head guy in the Department of Transport, the deputy minister. He said, okay, go ahead with it and keep me posted from time to time. So Wilbur Smith got the official sanction to go after flying saucers and to investigate and to find out what happened. As I said, all of this happened through the Canadian Embassy, which is in Washington, D.C. This is the old embassy building. And Wilbur Smith, before he died, he had cancer. He knew he was going to die. Made an effort to hide all his files. He told his wife told me that Wilbur told her that the government was going to come and get the files and that they were to be hidden. They hid the files. This document has not been found in the Canadian government files yet. It is an embassy document out of the Canadian Embassy, and in that document it's correspondence between Wilbur Smith and the Canadian Embassy in Washington, talking about the situation in Washington, D.C. And in on this one document written by a high-ranking official in the Canadian Embassy, he writes, the official position is still that nobody knows anything here much at all. We are, of course, keeping our ears and eyes open. If anything does develop, you will probably hear it through the Wright Salant channel. These are two military people. On the ambassador's instruction, no one in the embassy, apart from Wright and myself, is to discuss the matter with anybody. This is a stamped secret. It's out of the Canadian Embassy. Here's the second page of it, and on the second page, this Gordon Cox, who wrote it, says, the ambassador and I would be particularly interested in any indication you may have as to the possibility of an official U.S. government statement. Now, why are they waiting for a U.S. government statement? I'll show you why they're waiting. Wilbur Smith is dealing with Vannevar Bush. We can now prove he was dealing with Vannevar Bush. He got clearance to deal with the Americans. As Major Kehoe was involved, Wilbur Smith produced a study on the propulsion of flying saucers and sent it to Vannevar Bush in Washington, and he writes, I understand Kehoe was to take it to Dr. Bush for clearance. The important thing is clearance, not to read, for clearance. It's an official document. I do not know what Dr. Bush's reaction will be to the material contained in the major portion of the article and my revision, but his reaction would certainly be interesting, and I would like to have you have a talk with Kehoe at some time at your convenience to ascertain this point. Smith also, when he was down there, found out about hardware and bodies. Now, I've known this since the 1970s. We really didn't release this. I talked to his son, James Smith, who I'm going to introduce in a second, who basically thought he was under the Official Secrets Act. They didn't want to talk about this. This is James Smith. This is a 1950 photograph, Wilbur Smith with his son, James. James has come forward now to talk about what his father discovered in the United States, things that I had heard from inner circle members who had worked with Wilbur Smith. And here is an audio of Wilbur Smith talking about UFO hardware that had been sent by the Americans into Canada and that his father had handled.
Many times I do remember blue military cars pulling up to the house and leaving packages of things for him to do metallurgical analysis on. And we'd asked him what they were, and he said they were chunks that unidentified things that the military had either shot down or found.
Unidentified things, or did he actually use the word flying saucers? Or
yes, yeah. On a couple of instances, I remember packages about the size of a loaf of bread coming in. The box would contain a chunk of metal that he'd been told that the Air Force had shot a chunk off of a flying saucer, and they'd already done some analysis of it, and would like him to have a go at it too. So
now, was this the American Air Force, the Canadian Air Force?
Well, I don't remember what color the plate it was, but I mean, it came from the States, whether it was delivered to the house by a Canadian.
Yeah, so it came from the States. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
You actually saw some of these pieces as well, Jim?
Oh yes,
Okay.
I saw them when you unpacked the box and what's in there, and take a look at it.
How old would you have been then?
Oh well, looking 10 to 17 in that age group.
Did you get an opportunity to handle any of them? How would you know what was an unusual-looking piece of metal at the age of
I got to
17?
handle a few of them. One was a chunk about the size of a brick, semicircular in shape, and a very smooth metal, except where the jagged edges of where it had been disconnected from whatever it belonged to. It was quite heavy in terms of its size. He had analysis done of that one. I remember seeing that particular analysis sheet.
Wilbur Smith died in December of 1962. Shortly before he died, he was very sick at the time. He took time to meet with Bob Grove, who was out of the Cleveland Ufology Project. Bob Grove came back, made an audio tape. This is an excerpt from this audio tape made July the 8th, 1962, and Bob Grove talks about what Wilbur Smith told him about handling UFO hardware.
During the actual operation, however, of this, when Mr. Smith was on his feet, he was constantly visited by both Canadian government officials as well as American government officials. These were, of course, upper echelon people with attaché cases that were chained and locked to their wrists to make sure, of course, that none of the information was dropped or left behind in a station, a bus station or something. And so he had a number of these visits. They had samples they wanted him to analyze of hardware, that is actually metal that had been found. According to Mr. Smith, the United States military intelligence has tons of hardware. They had readily admitted to this upon interview by Mr. Smith during the time he was director of this research project in Canada, and they have much film.
Carol Halford Watkins was a member of the Inner Circle. There was 5 Inner Circle members, very close people who secretly worked with Wilbur Smith. They were from the Defense and Air Force and stuff, and they secretly worked with him on the side. She was the wife of, her husband was an Air Force officer, I believe. She stated that Wilbur Smith, she told us that Wilbur Smith had told her that in the Pentagon they had a room that he had been in and it had hardware. It was like a small museum of small pieces of hardware. Wilbur Smith also wrote about hardware. He writes in a letter written in 1958, in posting your representative with questions, be sure the questions you ask are exactly what you want to know. If you ask, does the Air Force have saucer hardware, you will get no truthfully. The hardware is not held by the Air Force. To another member of the Cleveland Ufology Project who was asking him about a piece in 1952 that Wilbur Smith had handled, that Wilbur Smith was told had been shot off a flying saucer, he says, you seem to be most interested in the UFO hardware. There is a great deal of this around, most of it in U.S. official, not U.S. Air Force hands. And the same fellow from the Cleveland Ufology Project, C.W. Fitch, interviewed him on the phone. I don't have the audio tape, but I have the transcript. And he's talking about this 52 piece, and he's trying to find out where Wilbur Smith sent it back. He said, you said that you had to return the piece of hardware. Did you return it to the Air Force, Mr. Smith? And Smith says, not the Air Force, much higher than that. And he said, the Central Intelligence Agency. And Smith chuckles and he said, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I don't care to go beyond that point. I can say it went into the hands of a highly classified group. You will have to solve that problem, their identity, for yourself. This is one of the pieces, I believe it was 1961. There was a huge explosion along the St. Lawrence River. There was 2 huge pieces that the Smith and his people recovered. This is a fragment off one of these pieces that's still held by somebody in Ottawa. Smith did a lot of analysis just before he died on this piece. He said there was micrometeorites embedded. It was exothermic. It had all sorts of weird properties. This is a picture of the thing. It's got a plastic over the picture, but this was one of the 2 big pieces that they recovered. When I presented the Smith material, a lot of people were very interested, but people are still into, when you get to the heavy material, you get into crash retrievals, and Wilbur Smith, unknown to many people, was actually involved with crash retrievals. Here's a letter that he writes, and he actually talks about, and this is, you remember, this is the head of the official Canadian government UFO study program, and here's what he says about crash retrievals. I do have knowledge from excellent sources that saucers have, and he spells it in capital letters, have crashed and fallen into the hands of Earth people. I have even handled some hardware, but all this is buried deep in classification and may as well be in the 4th dimension for all the good it is in establishing the reality of the craft or the people who manipulate them. Wilbur Smith's son again, James Smith, talks about the bodies. Now, this is the one that I had to talk to James for a while and explain to him he wasn't on the Official Secrets Act to tell this story. Here's his son talking about Wilbur Smith talking about seeing the bodies.
Jim, you mentioned that he was shown bodies at one point or something?
Yeah, on one of the times, he was in the States a lot, partly due to his work as a superintendent of radio regulations, so he had to deal with frequency allocations and channels, radio and that sort of business. He was frequently on committees in the States where they were working out joint frequency allocations, for example. And on several occasions, he was invited off to be shown things along that line.
That was pretty well under the Official Secrets Act, he told us. However, when just before he passed away at 62, he felt the act couldn't get him any more than that. So I did ask him, and he said yes, he saw the bodies. Did he describe them at all? Do you recall anything? Not that I can recall, except that the descriptions that had sort of been out and about were fairly accurate. I think there were descriptions of smallish types. I don't know about necessarily the coloring, but no, I don't remember a lot of those details. I just read that it satisfied my curiosity that he had seen them and that they were real.
On that interview, he didn't talk about the crashed saucer. I knew that Wilbur Smith had seen a crashed saucer. I'd known that story for many years. So I phoned James up and I asked him to give me a tape on the crashed saucer.
Buchanan told a story about crashed flying saucers, like you mentioned the bodies.
Yeah.
And I believe Buchanan mentioned a story about your father had seen a crashed saucer at a Air Force base outside of Washington.
That's right.
Did you ever hear that story?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So that is. Okay, your father told you that, or you just heard that from one of the other people?
No, my dad told me that.
Another strange one that we pulled up was the Frank Scully, who Wilbur Smith was very interested in this book. It came out in 1950, the same time that he went down to the United States to start this investigation. And he had actually done some interviews. I don't know if it's the next slide, but he had talked to a scientist in the United States. Oh, here it is. Okay, he talked to a scientist by the name of Dr. Robert Sarbacher, who had a scientific laboratory just down the road from the Canadian Embassy. The Canadians had actually used them for various things. And Smith asked him, he said, I've read Scully's book on the saucers and would like to know how much of it is true. And Sarbacher says to him, the facts reported in the book are substantially correct. So Wilbur Smith was basically working on the premise that the Scully book was right. A story that came out a number of years ago is an indicator that some of the Scully stuff may have been true, and that is that Smith's son never released the fact that his father had seen the bodies and the crafts till 2002. This story goes back. It's told by Harold Sherman, who was a prominent writer, and it was written up in the book UFO Dynamics by Bernhard Schwartz. And this was 1983, and the story apparently was told in the 1970s. This is long before Wilbur Smith was known to have seen the bodies. Now, the majority of the stuff that came from Frank Scully's book came from Silas Newton, who was a friend of Harold Sherman's. And according to Harold Sherman, Newton became acquainted with several high-ranking geophysicists who had actually seen the downed craft and occupants. And according to Sherman, through the intervention of Wilbur Smith, electronics expert and organizer of Project Magnet, Newton actually saw the bodies himself. The importance of this is that if Silas Newton made this story up, he was making up a very bizarre story because it doesn't make any sense that the Americans would be shown bodies by a foreign national. It didn't make any sense that Canadians would be shown the bodies. This is, as I go back to Dr. Robert Sarbacher, a lot of the material, or some of the material that came from the top secret memo about flying saucers exist, most highly classified, came from this Dr. Robert Sarbacher. I just want to read. This is the actual handwritten transcript that was found in Smith's files of the interview that was done through the Canadian Embassy. And Smith asks him, then the saucers do exist? And Sarbacher says, yes, they exist. And Smith asks him in this interview, do they operate, as Scully suggests, on magnetic principles? And Sarbacher replies, we have not been able to duplicate their performance. Smith asks, do they come from another planet? And Sarbacher says, all we know is we didn't make them, and it's pretty certain they didn't originate on Earth. Now, this was done in 1950, the interview, the top secret memo. In 1979, they released the top secret memo, and everybody started to race around to find out where Wilbur Smith had gotten the information from the top secret memo. Stanton Friedman tracked down Dr. Robert Sarbacher. He was still alive at that time, and he does an interview, and Sarbacher talks about the fact that there had been a crash in the West, and that the material had been moved to Wright Field, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and that he and a number of high-ranking scientists in Washington had been invited to the meetings to find out what the officials had found out about this crash. Here's the actual tape of Stanton Friedman talking to Dr. Robert Sarbacher, and Sarbacher describes what happened and confirms that the material that was in the top secret memo that had been given to Wilbur Smith was accurate.
I had to run my own business, my laboratory, and I couldn't go to all the meetings. Now they did have, or at least I was told, That's when Carl Compton was down there.
Yeah.
I was told that they had recovered a UFO with some people in it.
Bodies, whatever.
I don't know whether that's what I think I was told.
Did he tell you where?
Well, we were having a meeting at Wright Field, and I couldn't go.
Oh.
But later on, one of the fellows said to me that those guys, if they were people, were made like insects.
Did you get any clue as to where the crash had occurred?
Well, it was somewhere out west.
Okay, so, and do you think that this was, any idea what year this was?
Well, yeah. Let's see. Freddie was then in Washington. It was in the early 50s.
Okay, did they imply that the crash had just happened, or that this had happened somewhere?
Well, yeah, the conversation was that it had been recovered. The crash, that's what they were talking about.
Oh.
And they were going to have a meeting going out to discuss it.
Now, Friedman tried to press Sarbacher because Sarbacher was naming off a number of people like von Neumann and people, all these people were dead, and they were trying to, Friedman was trying to get a name of somebody who was alive. One of the people who eventually was identified as being one of the people who had been at the meetings was Dr. Eric Walker, who had just a who's who, just unbelievable. He was chairman of the Institute for Defense Analysis, which is the top military think tank in the United States. He was president of Penn State University for 15 years. He was the executive secretary of the Research and Development Board from 1950 to 51, which was in charge of all the weapons development for the U.S. military. He was a member of the Defense Science Board. When this information, well, hang on first. Sarbacher describes him. At the time, he doesn't know what his name was, but he describes in the interview with Friedman this fellow who was at all the meetings, and later on confirmed that it was Dr. Walker.
I remember there was one guy, frankly, I didn't like him very much. He had some company, as I had. Seems to me he was in Philadelphia. And he was going to all the meetings and acting very smug about it.
We took all the material. We proceeded, once we had this material, to interview Dr. Eric Walker. He was a guy that had a problem. He couldn't hang up the phone, but he didn't want to talk. And what we did is there was 5 or 6 researchers around the world. Everybody tried to interview him and tried to get him to talk. We put all the stuff in a book called UFOs, MJ-12 and the Government, which was published by MUFON a number of years ago. And we put in some of the, I haven't got the audios, but I have got a lot of the things that he said, and I'll just quickly go through them. When he was first approached, did you go to the meetings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? He said, yes, I attended the meetings concerning that subject matter. Why do you want to know about that? In most of his interviews, he would always say, this is a subject I don't talk about. He told us numerous times, various researchers told us, you are delving into an area that you can do absolutely nothing about. So why get involved with it or concerned about it? Why don't you just leave it alone and drop it? Forget about it. He said only a few are capable of handling this issue. Unless your mind ability is like Einstein's or otherwise, I do not think you can achieve anything. When the MJ-12 document was released at the MUFON conference in 1987, days later, Bill Steinman phoned up Dr. Walker and he said, I've got this MJ-12 document, I want to know. He didn't refer to the MJ-12 document, he cut him off. He said, I have known of MJ-12, I have known of them for 40 years. That was 1987, the MJ-12 document was released. 40 years earlier is 1947. Sometimes he did talk. He was asked, have we captured anything? We must have. And he said, sure. This was an interesting one. Stanton Friedman interviewed Dr. Walker twice. In the second interview was 1990. Dr. Walker told him, I haven't been involved with UFOs for 25 years. We got that information and went it back, and it came out to 1965. Walker lived in State College, Pennsylvania, about 100 miles from Kecksburg as the crow flies. He had a pilot's license. They had an airport at the Penn State University, so of course we immediately went to him and said, there's an incident that happened in Kecksburg in 1965. Were you there? We didn't even have to tell him that it involved a UFO crash. He said, well, we went there. There were 2 from the military, but not on duty. When we asked him what it was, he said, I can't talk about it. His son has now entered the picture. We were looking for a UFO file. We knew he had a UFO file. He was keeping it on us, on the various people. So we were looking for this UFO file. And his son has now confirmed there was a UFO file. This is what a researcher from Canada wrote me as to what Dr. Walker's son, who's a medical doctor, told him. He, Brian Walker, saw a file that contained a number of official government documents, but he claimed he did not read them. He recalls that there were drawings, but he did not mention of what, discs, bodies, etc. He claimed that the file contained information on an event in Pennsylvania and one in the southwestern United States. He does not recall seeing any mention of other persons. He thinks his father destroyed it before his death, as it was never located afterwards. I was at Penn State 3 times. I could never find it. Expert witness testimony, when the Walker story sort of fell apart and it really didn't go anywhere, I started to go towards expert witness testimony, trying to elevate the type of evidence that would take to win the chess game. A number of executions, we execute somebody almost every day in the United States, and in almost all executions, it's witness testimony that puts the person to death. And expert witness testimony is even better material, because the higher the level of the witness, the more it's believed by a jury. If I were to call witnesses, these are some of the witnesses I would call. The first I would call is Danny Sheehan, who worked on the Pentagon Papers defending the New York Times. He worked on the Silkwood case, which shut down the nuclear industry. He worked on 3 Mile Island. He defended John Mack. He was one of the people who exposed Oliver North in the Iran-Contra affair. He studied under Kissinger. He ran the Christic Institute. He's got an incredible background. He tells a story that he worked on 2 studies that were done for President Jimmy Carter. One was on extraterrestrial intelligence, one was on UFOs. He tells a story that Marcia Smith, who is still in the government, she's still working for the Congressional Research Service, commissioned him to work on these studies, and that he said in order to do this, he would have to see the classified Blue Book files. Here's Danny Sheehan talking about what he saw in this building, which is the Madison Building. It's one of the 3 buildings of the Library of Congress.
Back in 1977, when I was asked to participate as a special consultant to the Library of Congress research group analysis for President Carter, I was given access to the Project Blue Book files, the classified sections of them, during the preparation for a seminar which I was asked to present to the top 50 scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California in the SETI program. And in that context, I was allowed to review the classified sections of the Blue Book project. And in that section, I came across absolutely clear pictures, photographs of a UFO that was on the ground. It had apparently crashed. It was stuck in the side of an embankment. There was snow all around in the photographs, and there were United States Air Force personnel in the photographs measuring this particular craft, taking photographs of it. You could see them in the number of these photographs, and then there were actually close-up photos from different perspectives of the vehicle, and they actually had insignia on the side of the vehicle that they had taken some close-up pictures of. And so, I mean, when I saw this, in the context where I'd been allowed into this room downstairs in the new building of the Library of Congress, it hadn't even been opened yet. This was a brand new building. They had a big special room downstairs. There were Air Force guards at the doors. When I actually saw these photographs in the files, I said, well, look, now that I've seen this, and I know that the United States Air Force has these photographs, that they've got this vehicle, they've obviously got it. Here are the photographs.
Of the 2 studies, when I interviewed Danny Sheehan, he talked about the 2 studies that were produced. He saw them before they went to the House of Representatives. In the one study, which was the extraterrestrial intelligence study, Danny Sheehan mentioned this as being in the study that went to Jimmy Carter.
She went forward and supervised 2 of the final studies. The first study reached the conclusion, and this is an official United States government Congressional Research Service report that was prepared by the Congressional Research Service Science and Technology Division and sent to the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Representatives, who in turn sent it to the President. And in this report, they concluded that there were from 2 to 6, at least from 2 to 6, highly technological, intelligent civilizations other than that on our planet here in our galaxy.
The second study was the UFO study, and in that study, Sheehan refers to a technological conclusion that was in their report.
And secondly, they prepared a full report on the UFO phenomenon and actually had diagrams of all of the different shaped UFO craft that were there, and in fact projected that it appeared to be in a certain number of cases, and they indicated that from 5 to 6% of these cases of these sightings, that there was absolutely no other rational explanation for these phenomena, given the caliber of the witnesses, the caliber of the corroboration of the sightings, to lead to any conclusion other than the fact that they appeared to be coming from one or more of these 2 to 6 extraterrestrial civilizations in our galaxy.
As a sidelight to this, when I presented this material at the X conference, I was approached by a congressional staffer who was absolutely horrified that she did not know that these congressional research reports had been put out. And I said, well, Danny Sheehan said he'll testify in front of Congress, he'll talk to anybody in Congress, he will swear under oath that these events occurred. Marcia Smith is still there. She said, well, I'm going to get to the bottom of it, and if I don't get to the bottom of it, I'm going to my congressman, he'll defend me, and I'm going to get to the bottom of this. 2 weeks later, she was telling me how busy she was and how her phone was tapped and how she couldn't help me. It is a tough thing to break through. This is a case where the witnesses are all still there, the people are still in the government, everything is together, and I just can't believe that we can't get to the bottom of this story. The witness I would call is in connection with the Jackie Gleason story. This is a story that occurred in connection with President Nixon. Gleason had spoken to a number of presidents on UFOs. I believe he said 3 presidents on UFOs. Was terribly interested in the paranormal phenomena. He lived just outside of Miami on a golf course, and that was very near the White House, or the Southern White House, which Nixon had at Key Biscayne, Florida. They were very good friends. They would golf together. He was a contributor. He was a Republican, contributed to the Nixon's campaigns. Here's the 2 of them together at Jackie Gleason's golf course in 1973. 1973 is also significant because this is the story that was told by Beverly McKittrick, who is now going under the name of Beverly Gleason, who told the story that one night Jackie Gleason had come home and had told her that he had gotten access to dead alien bodies at Homestead Air Force Base, and that access had been given to him by his friend, President Richard Nixon. The significant thing of this is that Nixon spent 293 days at the Key Biscayne compound, and he made 92 trips there. Every trip from, I guess, Andrews Air Force Base, he would fly to Homestead. He landed at Homestead every single time, would fly by helicopter from Homestead to the compound. So he would have known the base like the back of his hand. The story was written up by Beverly McKittrick in 1983 in the National Enquirer. She puts the whole story in there. The significant part about this is she's still around. Researcher David Rudiak and I tracked her down, and Kenny Young, out of a researcher, has interviewed her in the last year twice. She's maintaining the story. This happened. This whole story about the bodies is, as far as she's concerned, true. The other witness I would call would be Shirley MacLaine. The Shirley MacLaine story started with actor Nicolas Cage appearing on the David Letterman show. He tells the story that Shirley MacLaine had told him, that Jimmy Carter had told her that he had seen the bodies in the craft. It's a story apparently he's still standing by, and Shirley MacLaine appears on the Larry King show 2 weeks later, and she is approached, or a phone call comes in from researcher Art Greenfield out of Florida, and he asks her the question, and here's the actual audio tape of what Shirley MacLaine says.
Good evening, Larry and Shirley.
Hi.
About 2 weeks ago, Nicolas Cage was on the Letterman show and said that Shirley had told him that President Carter had told her he had seen recovered alien spacecraft and aliens in the hangar. Could you tell me exactly what President Carter said?
He didn't tell me that, but he told me many times that when I first rode out on a limb, that he would support me, that it was true, that there were occupants. Why should we be the only people in the universe? He wanted to shine the sunshine laws on intelligence, to expose it, to see how the people would react, but he didn't and wouldn't and couldn't, as he explained to me.
The recent material I've done on Jimmy Carter seems to indicate Jimmy Carter got a lot farther than most people did. It does. I would now say, and I've done a lot of study on it, that he did get a briefing. He forced a briefing. The other witness that I would call would be Steven Spielberg, who has had many contacts with various presidents. There's two particular stories I'd like to deal with. The first one deals with Jimmy Carter. There was always a story that NASA put money into Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and that Jimmy Carter had a private briefing or had a private screening of Close Encounters. The Philadelphia Inquirer said that Jimmy Carter's favorite movie was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. When I went to the Carter Library, I tried to track this whole thing down and find out whether they had ever met. And the White House records can tell you how many times they met with the president, how many times they talked on the phone. Any contact with the president is religiously cataloged by the White House. And they had absolutely nothing on Steven Spielberg ever having any contact with Jimmy Carter. So we did an alpha search, which pulls everything they've got. And what we found, it was a very strange thing in the Carter file, the alpha thing. All it had in the Spielberg file was one photocopied photograph, and this is the one here. It's just a photocopy, and you can see it's Spielberg on the right-hand side. You can see it's Jimmy Carter on the left-hand side, and the archivist, who was very interested in UFOs, said that's not Rosalind Carter in the middle. But anyway, what they had done is they had put the paper, the actual letter, over Jimmy Carter's face, and it says, "The president thought that you would enjoy receiving the enclosed photograph." And then on covering Steven Spielberg, they have Steven Spielberg's address and the envelope. So this was something that I'm sure that they could clear up as to the whole, whether Jimmy Carter had contacts and had seen this thing privately. It's not in the records. The one that is in the records is the Reagan. In June of 1982, Steven Spielberg went to the White House and showed E.T. the extraterrestrial to President Carter and President Reagan and Nancy. When I went there, they were very, all they would release is this one photograph to me. They wouldn't tell me anything about who was in the room. They wouldn't even tell me how many people were. And when I pressed the issue, I said, well, what's going to be released if you tell me how many people were in the room? And all they would release to me is there was 37 people in the room for the screening of E.T. the extraterrestrial. The important thing is that Steven Spielberg told the story to Jamie Chanderay, another producer in Los Angeles, that near the end of the movie, E.T. the extraterrestrial, Reagan had leaned over to him and said, "I bet you there aren't 6 people in this whole room know how true this story is." When we tried to, Billy Cox from Florida Today, and numerous people tried to contact Spielberg. Spielberg will not talk about this. His publicist says he won't comment on private conversations with the president. The key witness, if we're going to have a jury and we're going to have a trial, the key witnesses that you need are the presidents. When I went through the thing, I went through photographs, I went through Wilbur Smith, went through Sarbacher, went through Walker, went through the crash retrieval. When I saw the presidents, when I saw the opportunity to look at presidential files, I suddenly realized that this game could be won, that you could get a checkmate move on this thing. The presidents are extremely important for a number of reasons. They're the constitutional head of the military. If we believe that the military is collecting the material, all the best material from the military should end up on the desk of the president. They're also important because they're the constitutional head of the executive branch. If it's not the military, then it's the executive branch, whether it's NSA, CIA. He controls all those different institutions as well. Therefore, the best information out of NSA and CIA should be sitting on the president's desk. He should have the best material. The most important thing about the president is he is the ultimate authority. He is the person that if he says UFOs are somebody else's technology, it's over. It's also very important because in almost all the other UFO incidents, whether it's photographs or eyewitness testimony, a skeptic can always trump it by saying something stupid. There's nobody that can trump the president. You can't say the president shouldn't have known, the president didn't know, or anything like that. The president is the ultimate authority. And as I said, if the president comes out and says UFOs are somebody else's technology, you might as well strike up the band and play the last waltz because the party is over. It's that important. So I went on a mission to try to find out what the presidents knew, and the presidents have had a lot of involvement with UFOs. The first that I'll refer to is General Robert Landry, who in his oral history at the Truman Library states quite clearly, he was the Air Force advisor to Truman. He stated quite clearly that he had briefed the president every 3 months from February of 1948 until the president left office in January 1953 on UFOs, but he did it orally, so there's no record. This is a story that sort of goes to the Jimmy Carter thing. This is another one that was told by Marcia Smith, the one that gave Danny Sheehan access to the files. And the story that she told was that President Jimmy Carter, when he was coming into office, asked for the UFO files from then CIA Director George Bush, who was the CIA Director for President Ford, and that he had been denied the files. In terms of Jimmy Carter, he went into office, he tried to force the issue, he wanted to get the files out, but what most people don't know is that Jimmy Carter had a sort of a side to this thing, that there was one exception, and here's the actual audio tape of Jimmy Carter talking about the one exception to UFOs that he wouldn't release, which is basically continue the cover-up.
I don't see any reason to keep information like that secret, but there may be some aspects of the UFO information that, with which I'm not familiar, that might be related to some secret experiments that we were doing that might involve our national security or new weapon systems. I certainly wouldn't release that. But if it was something removed from our national security, you know, in my opinion as president, I would go ahead and release it. I see nothing wrong with that.
I've worked a lot on the Clinton presidency. I filed a Freedom of Information request, got 1,000 pages, which detailed the Rockefeller Initiative, all this sort of stuff. Collected a lot of material. I sort of think now he knew a little bit more than he's letting on. Both he and Hillary were extremely interested in the phenomenon. Hillary was really interested, had actually indirectly contacted 2 UFO researchers to get material. One of the stories I want to bring up here is the story of Sarah McClendon, who unfortunately is now dead and can't really testify, but it's a story that Stephen Greer tells about her approaching Clinton, because she didn't care what she asked. She asked Clinton about the UFO thing, and here was the response, according to Stephen Greer, of what President Carter told Sarah McClendon, who was one of the top White House reporters.
Bill Clinton leaned over and told Sarah McClendon, who hosted us at the National Press Club on May 9th, this is a story I haven't told, but I'm going to tell you now. She told me this. Bill Clinton leaned over to her and said, well, she brought this issue up to Bill Clinton. I says, why don't you do something about what Dr. Greer and this group's trying to do? And he bent over and he said, Sarah, there's a secret government within the government, and I don't control it.
I've spent a lot of time trying to get one particular question to the people in power, and this is the top people, the people who you can't trump. The skeptics won't be able to counter. One of the people that I did actually get in contact with was Dick Cheney, who some people figure is running the country, Chief of Staff for Ford, Secretary of Defense for Bush, Vice President under the President Bush, very powerful guy in the military establishment, knows what's going on, and he's so important that I have a UFO most wanted, and I have him as the king of clubs. I have lots of them, but here is my actual question to him on the Diana Rehm show, which is out of Washington, D.C., and I guess he was caught off guard. He probably never had a UFO question before. He actually makes a mistake. Listen very carefully. Here's myself asking him, and he's speaking from the White House, and I think it was the last time he ever went on a radio talk show.
Good morning. Mr. Cheney, I have a question. Since the statement made by George Bush last July, there's been a vicious rumor circulating in the UFO community that you've been read into the UFO program. So my question to you is, in any of your government jobs, have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? And if you have, when was it and what were you told?
Well, if I had been briefed on that, I'm sure it was probably classified and I couldn't talk about it.
Is there investigation going on within this administration, Mr. Vice President, as to UFOs?
I have not come across the subject since I've been back in government, I guess since January 20th.
All right.
I've been in a lot of meetings, but I don't recall one on UFOs.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, you can see he said it was classified. If it's classified, there's documents. If there's documents, they haven't let them out. And okay, if there's documents, they haven't let them out. And if they haven't let them out, there's a cover-up. I was very surprised he said it was probably classified. This is a story that when I got into this thing, somebody came to help me. Now, because I can't tell you who made the phone calls and which presidents were talked to, just consider it a rumor in the UFO community, but I can assure you this happened. 2 presidents were contacted off the record. And basically, they were asked the question about, is this somebody else's technology? There's an old story that if it walks like a duck, waddles like a duck, quacks like a duck, and has sex with other ducks, chances are it's a duck. I can tell you the questions were asked, and I can tell you what the president said. It's a duck. There was no denial. They said at no time would they ever release the fact that they were briefed. So to me, there's a possibility that there's only one more move in the chess game, and that is that the president is approached and is asked the ultimate question. Were you briefed? You can talk to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter will talk about the interest he has in UFOs, that he had a sighting, all this sort of stuff. I don't care about the sighting. I don't care what you think about it. I just want to know one question. Did someone from the NSA, someone official, walk into your office and brief you on the subject of UFOs? Did you sign off on it? If some president stands up, and if they are approached, if they lie, we're finished. I mean, you can't believe anything then if he will lie. But basically it comes down to if the president says, yes, he was briefed, as far as I'm concerned, the press, the public will start to pay attention. Because as far as I'm concerned, you don't go in and brief the most powerful man in the world on a subject that doesn't exist. Thank you very much.